I am Clara Donovan, 31 years old, a woman who spent 12 years of her youth standing behind the reception desk of Lancaster Hotels, stitching together every invisible detail of lavish events to conceal the fractures in Boston's upper-crust world. The night of the fundraising gala, the ballroom blazed with crystal chandeliers, the scent of champagne mingling with white lilies arranged on long tables draped in satin. I thought I would finally be recognized, but instead, Victoria Lancaster, the chief executive officer, raised her glass amid applause, her voice sharp as a blade. "She can make reservations for you, but don't dream of sitting at our boardroom table." Laughter ricocheted off the glass walls, hammering down into my chest like a mallet against stone. In my hand, the metal name badge trembled, its edges pressing into my palm. That night, in the darkness of the staff changing room, I set the badge on the table and made a vow. One day, I would no longer stand behind a reception desk. I would bring the entire Lancaster empire to its knees. The memory of that night clung to me like smoke, seeping into every corner of my mind, even as I tried to wash it away. I drove home through empty streets, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold and red, my knuckles white against the steering wheel. The apartment I rented was small, a studio with a single window overlooking a brick wall, but it was mine. I sat on the edge of my bed, still wearing the black dress required for gala staff, and stared at my reflection in the mirror across the room. My face looked hollow, my eyes red-rimmed but dry. I had learned long ago that tears were a luxury I couldn't afford, not when survival demanded every ounce of composure I could muster. Lancaster Hotels had been my entire world since I was 19. I started as a part-time front desk assistant while attending community college at night, my tuition paid in installments scraped together from paychecks and tips. My mother had died when I was 16, leaving behind nothing but debt and a worn-out Honda Civic. My father was a ghost, a man whose name I knew but whose face I'd forgotten. I had no safety net, no trust fund, no family connections to open doors. Every step forward was earned through hours spent smiling at guests who barely glanced at me, answering phones with rehearsed politeness, solving problems that were never officially my responsibility, but somehow always became mine to fix. Victoria Lancaster had hired me herself, back when the hotel was expanding and needed reliable staff. She had looked me over with cold, appraising eyes, the kind of gaze that measured worth in seconds. "You'll do," she had said, not unkindly, but with the indifference one might show a piece of furniture deemed adequate for its purpose. I had been grateful then, pathetically grateful, because a job at Lancaster Hotels meant stability, prestige, a line on a resume that could open other doors someday. I worked harder than anyone, arriving early, staying late, volunteering for double shifts and holiday coverage. I memorized the preferences of VIP guests, anticipated needs before they were spoken, diffused conflicts with a combination of charm and efficiency that became my signature. But no matter how hard I worked, I remained invisible. The executives who passed through the lobby never learned my name. The board members who held meetings in the conference rooms upstairs treated me like part of the decor, their eyes sliding past me as if I were wallpaper. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was building something, gaining experience, learning the business from the ground up. I told myself that one day, my dedication would be rewarded. Then I met Ethan Gray. He was 28, charming in the way that wealth permits, with dark hair that fell just slightly into his eyes, and a smile that suggested he had never been refused anything in his life. His father, Jonathan Gray, was a major shareholder in Lancaster Hotels, a man whose approval Victoria sought with the desperation of someone whose empire depended on the favor of titans. Ethan came to the hotel often, ostensibly for business, but mostly, I suspected, because he was bored. He started lingering at the front desk, asking questions that had nothing to do with reservations or amenities. He wanted to know what I studied, what I read, what I thought about the pretentious art installation Victoria had commissioned for the lobby. I should have known better. I should have recognized the danger in his attention, the way his interest felt like sunlight after years in shadow. But I was lonely, and he was kind, and kindness from someone like him felt like validation. We began meeting for coffee after my shifts, then dinners at quiet restaurants far from the hotel, where no one would recognize us. He told me about the pressure of living up to his father's expectations, the suffocating weight of a future mapped out before he was born. I told him about my dreams of building something of my own, of creating a business that valued people, not just profit margins. For 6 months, I believed I had found something real. Then one evening, Ethan took me to a small Italian restaurant in the North End, the kind of place with checkered tablecloths and candles and wine bottles. He held my hand across the table, his thumb tracing circles on my palm, and I thought he was going to tell me he loved me. Instead, he said, "Clara, I need to tell you something. My father, he's arranged a marriage to the daughter of a business partner. It's been in the works for years. I don't have a choice." The words landed like stones thrown into still water, ripples spreading outward, disturbing everything. I pulled my hand back slowly, carefully, as if sudden movement might shatter me. "You don't have a choice," I repeated, my voice flat, testing the weight of the phrase. "I'm sorry," he said, and the worst part was that he looked genuinely pained, as if his suffering was equal to mine, as if being forced to choose wealth and status over love was some great tragedy. "I care about you, Clara, I really do. But this is bigger than us. My family's legacy, the company. If I don't do this, everything falls apart." I stood up, gathered my coat, and walked out without another word. He didn't follow. I took the subway home, surrounded by strangers, and felt more alone than I ever had in my life. After that, something in me calcified. The softness I had allowed myself to feel hardened into something sharp and unforgiving. I threw myself into work with renewed intensity, not out of hope, but out of necessity. I needed to survive, and survival meant becoming indispensable. I started paying closer attention to the business side of the hotel, studying financial reports left carelessly on desks, listening to conversations in the elevator, absorbing information like a sponge. I taught myself about hospitality management, revenue optimization, customer experience design. I read books on negotiation, leadership, strategic planning. At night, in my tiny apartment, I sketched business plans on legal pads, imagining a company built on principles I wished Lancaster Hotels embodied. 2 years after Ethan's betrayal, I launched Grayson Solutions, a small startup focused on hospitality software. The name was deliberate, a quiet acknowledgement of what I had lost and what I was determined to build in its place. I worked from my apartment, coding late into the night, cold calling hotels and restaurants, pitching a product I believed could revolutionize how small businesses managed customer relationships. The early days were brutal, a constant scramble for clients, funding, credibility. I lived on ramen and black coffee, sacrificed sleep, ignored every warning sign that I was burning myself out. But slowly, impossibly, Grayson Solutions began to grow. I hired my first employee, a developer named Marcus Chen, who believed in the vision as much as I did. We landed our first major client, a boutique hotel chain in New York. Revenue trickled in, then flowed, then poured. Within 3 years, we had expanded to 20 employees, offices in Boston and San Francisco, contracts with hospitality groups across the country. And then, emboldened by success, I made a decision that would change everything. I sent a partnership proposal to Lancaster Hotels. The letter was professional, meticulously researched, outlining how Grayson Solutions could streamline their operations, improve guest satisfaction, increase profitability. I knew it was a long shot, knew that Victoria Lancaster would likely dismiss it out of hand. But I sent it anyway, because I needed to prove to myself that I had moved beyond the girl who stood behind the reception desk, that I had become someone who could stand at the negotiating table. Victoria's response came swiftly and publicly. At a shareholders' meeting I was not invited to, but heard about through industry contacts. She held up my proposal in front of the board and Richard Lancaster, her husband and the company's chairman. According to witnesses, she tore the letter in half with deliberate slowness, then said, "This receptionist thinks she can teach us how to run our business. How quaint." The room erupted in laughter. When the story reached me, delivered by a sympathetic former colleague, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The humiliation should have destroyed me, should have sent me spiraling into doubt and despair. Instead, it clarified everything. Victoria Lancaster had drawn a line in the sand, declared war without realizing she had armed her enemy with purpose. I made a new vow that day, one far more specific than the promise I had whispered in the changing room years before. I would not just succeed in spite of Lancaster Hotels. I would surpass them, eclipse them, and when they were desperate and broken, I would be the one deciding whether they deserved mercy. The years that followed were a blur of relentless expansion. Grayson Solutions evolved into Donovan Global, a tech conglomerate specializing in hospitality, real estate, and luxury services. I raised capital from venture firms, then went public, watching the stock price climb as analysts praised our innovation and growth trajectory. I hired the best talent, cultivated relationships with industry leaders, spoke at conferences where my name was printed in bold letters on banners and programs. Forbes ran a profile calling me the woman redefining luxury. TechCrunch featured Donovan Global as one of the fastest growing companies in the sector. And through it all, I kept one eye on Lancaster Hotels. I watched as their market share eroded, as younger, more agile competitors ate into their dominance, as their failure to innovate left them vulnerable. I watched as Victoria's arrogance blinded her to the changing landscape, as Richard's conservatism prevented necessary risks. I watched, and I waited, because I knew that empires built on entitlement eventually crumble under their own weight. Then came the invitation to the Global Business Summit in San Francisco, a gathering of industry titans, disruptors, and visionaries. I was invited as a keynote speaker, a recognition of how far Donovan Global had come. The summit was being held at the Fairmont, one of San Francisco's most prestigious venues, and the guest list read like a directory of power: CEOs, investors, policymakers, influencers. I accepted the invitation immediately. What I didn't know until the day before the event was that Richard and Victoria Lancaster were also attending. Their presence was announced in the summit program, listed under a panel discussion about legacy brands adapting to modern markets. The irony was almost too perfect to be real. On the morning of my keynote, I stood in my hotel suite at the Fairmont, looking out at the fog rolling over the Golden Gate Bridge, and felt a strange mixture of anticipation and detachment. I had spent years building toward this moment, and now that it had arrived, it felt both monumental and inevitable. I dressed carefully, choosing a tailored navy suit that projected authority without ostentation, paired with simple jewelry and heels that added 3 inches to my height. In the mirror, I saw a woman who looked nothing like the girl in the black staff uniform, the one who had cowered under Victoria's disdain. This woman was polished, powerful, unshakable. The keynote was scheduled for 10 a.m. in the grand ballroom. I arrived early, walking through the space as technicians tested lighting and sound systems. The room could hold 1,000 people, with rows of seats sloping toward a stage framed by massive LED screens. My name and company logo were projected in sharp, modern fonts, impossible to miss. I stood at the podium, testing the microphone, and allowed myself a moment of quiet satisfaction. This was mine. I had earned it. Then the doors opened, and attendees began filtering in. I watched from the wings as the seats filled, saw the mix of eager young entrepreneurs and seasoned executives, the journalists with press badges, and the investors scanning the room for opportunities. And then, near the back, I saw them. Richard Lancaster, silver-haired and distinguished, moving with the slow confidence of someone who had never questioned his place in the world. And beside him, Victoria Lancaster, impeccably dressed in a cream suit, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp, assessing, calculating. Our gazes met across the crowded room, and for a fraction of a second, I saw recognition flicker in her face, followed immediately by something I hadn't expected: surprise. She knew who I was, of course. My name had been in the program, and even Victoria Lancaster couldn't ignore a CEO whose company was valued at billions. But seeing me here, in this context, as the keynote speaker she had come to hear, seemed to jar her in a way I found deeply, quietly satisfying. I smiled, not broadly, just a slight curve of the lips, and turned away. When the moderator introduced me, the applause was thunderous. I walked onto the stage, the spotlight bright and warm, and looked out at the sea of faces. I didn't seek out Victoria and Richard in the crowd. I didn't need to. I knew they were there, and that was enough. "Good morning," I began, my voice steady and clear. "My name is Clara Donovan, and 12 years ago, I was a receptionist." The room fell silent after my opening words, the kind of silence that hums with attention, with curiosity, with 1,000 minds leaning forward at once. I let it breathe for a moment, let the weight of that statement settle over the audience like snow. "I worked the front desk of one of Boston's most prestigious hotels," I continued, pacing slowly across the stage, my hands gesturing with practiced ease. "I greeted guests, managed reservations, solved problems that weren't technically my job, but became mine anyway. I was good at what I did, exceptional even, but no matter how hard I worked, I remained invisible to the people who mattered. I was furniture, background noise, a necessary function, but not a person." I paused, turning to face the audience directly. And then one night, at a Gala fundraiser, someone I had worked alongside for years stood in front of a room full of powerful people and said something that changed my life. She said, and I quote, "She can make reservations for you, but don't dream of sitting at our boardroom table." A ripple of discomfort passed through the crowd, a collective intake of breath. I saw some audience members glance around, as if trying to identify the villain in the story. I didn't name Victoria. I didn't have to. The people who needed to know already did. "That moment could have destroyed me," I said, my voice softer now, more intimate. "It should have. But instead, it gave me clarity. I realized that I had been waiting for permission. Permission to be seen, permission to matter, permission to succeed. And I understood finally that no one was going to grant me that permission. I had to take it. I clicked a remote, and the screen behind me lit up with the Donovan Global logo, sleek and modern, a visual representation of everything I had built. So I left. I started a company with nothing but a laptop and a belief that there was a better way to do business, a way that valued people, innovation, and integrity over legacy and entitlement. Today, Donovan Global employs over 3,000 people, operates in 15 countries, and generates $2 billion in annual revenue. We didn't get here by asking for permission. We got here by earning it. The applause was deafening, a standing ovation that rolled through the ballroom like a wave. I stood at the center of the stage, absorbing it, not with arrogance, but with quiet, earned pride. When I finally raised a hand to signal for quiet, the room obeyed instantly. I continued with the rest of my keynote, discussing innovation in hospitality, the importance of human-centered design, the future of luxury in an age of experience over opulence. But the real message had already been delivered in those opening minutes. I had told my story, and in doing so, I had rewritten the narrative Victoria Lancaster thought she controlled. After the keynote, I was swarmed by attendees, journalists asking for interviews, investors proposing partnerships, young entrepreneurs seeking advice. I handled each interaction with practiced grace, all the while aware of two figures standing at the edge of the crowd, waiting. When the crowd finally thinned, Richard Lancaster approached. Victoria stood a few steps behind him, her expression carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in her jaw, the way her hands gripped her clutch a little too tightly. "Ms. Donovan," Richard said, extending a hand. His voice was warm, professional, betraying nothing. "That was quite a speech. Congratulations on your success." I shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, Mr. Lancaster. I appreciate that." Victoria stepped forward, her smile polished and empty. "It's inspiring to see how far you've come, Clara. Truly." The use of my first name was deliberate, an attempt to establish familiarity, to minimize the distance between us. I didn't return the favor. "Mrs. Lancaster," I said, my tone polite but distant. "I'm glad you found it inspiring." An awkward silence stretched between us, filled with everything unspoken. Then Richard cleared his throat. "We'd love to catch up sometime, discuss potential opportunities. Donovan Global and Lancaster Hotels could have synergies worth exploring." I tilted my head slightly, as if considering the offer. "Perhaps," I said. "Though I imagine you're quite busy these days. I hear the market has been challenging for legacy brands." Victoria's smile didn't falter, but I saw the flash of something sharp in her eyes. "Every business faces challenges," she said smoothly. "The key is adaptation." "Indeed," I replied. "Well, if you'll excuse me, I have another session to prepare for. It was lovely seeing you both." I walked away without waiting for a response, my heels clicking against the marble floor, and I felt their eyes on my back, heavy with calculation, and something that might have been regret. But the real moment came later that evening, in the elevator of the Fairmont Hotel. I had just finished a dinner with potential investors, and I was heading back to my suite, exhausted but exhilarated. The elevator doors opened on the lobby level, and Victoria Lancaster stepped inside. We were alone. The doors closed, and the elevator began its ascent. The silence between us was thick, suffocating. Victoria stood on the opposite side of the small space, her reflection visible in the polished brass panels. I kept my eyes forward, refusing to give her the satisfaction of acknowledgement. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and edged with something I couldn't quite identify. "You've come a long way, Clara." I turned to look at her directly. "Yes, I have." "That line in your speech," she continued, her tone carefully measured, "about someone telling you that you didn't belong at the boardroom table. That was about me, wasn't it?" I didn't answer immediately. I let the question hang in the air, let her feel the weight of her own words reflected back at her. "Does it matter?" I asked finally. Victoria's composure cracked, just slightly. "I never meant—" "You meant exactly what you said," I interrupted, my voice calm but unyielding. "You meant that I was beneath you, that someone like me could never be anything more than a servant in your empire. And you were right to believe that at the time. Because back then, I was still waiting for people like you to see my worth. I've since learned that's a waste of time." The elevator dinged, and the doors opened on the executive floor. I stepped out, then turned back to face her. "The difference between us, Victoria, is that I built my empire from nothing. You inherited yours, and we both know which one is more valuable." The doors closed before she could respond, and I walked down the hallway to my suite, my heart pounding but my steps steady. Over the following months, I watched Lancaster Hotels with the attention of a chess player studying an opponent's board. The signs of decline were subtle at first: a dip in quarterly earnings, the closure of an underperforming location, the quiet departure of a senior executive. But for someone who understood the industry as intimately as I did, the patterns were unmistakable. Lancaster Hotels was bleeding, slowly but surely, and no one at the helm seemed capable of stopping it. I didn't cause their decline. I didn't need to. The company's failure to innovate, their reliance on a brand name that meant less with each passing year, their inability to compete with nimbler, more technologically advanced competitors, all of this was self-inflicted. Victoria and Richard had coasted on legacy for too long, and the market had moved on without them. But I did watch, and when the moment was right, I prepared to act. The call came in early spring, just as cherry blossoms were beginning to bloom in Boston. My assistant buzzed through to my office. "Ms. Donovan, there's a Richard Lancaster on the line. He says it's urgent." I had been expecting this call for weeks. I took a slow sip of my coffee, set the cup down precisely in the center of its saucer, and said, "Put him through." Richard's voice came through the speaker, steady but strained. "Clara, thank you for taking my call." "Of course, Richard," I said, my tone cordial. "What can I do for you?" There was a pause, a hesitation that spoke volumes. "I'll get straight to the point. Lancaster Hotels is in a difficult position. We've had some setbacks, and we're exploring options for restructuring. I'm calling to see if Donovan Global might be interested in a partnership, or perhaps an acquisition." I leaned back in my chair, swiveling slightly to look out the window at the Boston skyline. "An acquisition," I repeated, testing the words. "You want me to buy Lancaster Hotels?" "Or invest significantly," Richard clarified quickly. "We're flexible. The important thing is preserving the Lancaster legacy while ensuring the company's future." I let the silence stretch, let him feel the discomfort of waiting. Then I said, "I'll need to see financials, full transparency, balance sheets, debt obligations, revenue projections, and I'll need time to consider whether this is a worthwhile investment." "Of course," Richard said, relief evident in his voice. "I'll have everything sent over by end of day. And Clara, thank you. I know this is an unusual situation, but I believe it could be mutually beneficial." "We'll see," I said, and ended the call. The financial documents arrived as promised, delivered via secure email along with a cover letter from Richard emphasizing the tremendous opportunity and storied brand Lancaster Hotels represented. I spent the next week reviewing every line item, every contract, every hidden liability. What I found was worse than I had anticipated. Lancaster Hotels was not just struggling, it was drowning. Debt had ballooned from aggressive expansion during better years. Several properties were hemorrhaging money, kept open only out of pride. The company's technology infrastructure was a decade behind competitors, and customer satisfaction scores had been declining steadily for 5 years. The brand still carried weight, but that weight was becoming an anchor rather than an asset. I called a meeting with my executive team: Marcus Chen, now Chief Technology Officer, Lena Ortiz, Chief Financial Officer, and David Park, Chief Strategy Officer. We gathered in the conference room, the financial reports spread across the table like evidence at a trial. "We could buy them outright," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair. "Absorb the brand, strip the assets, integrate what's useful, and shut down the rest. It's a distressed asset play." Lena shook her head. The debt makes it risky. We'd be taking on significant liabilities, and the brand isn't worth what it used to be. Millennial and Gen Z travelers don't care about legacy the way older generations did. David tapped his pen against his notebook. But there's symbolic value in acquiring Lancaster Hotels. It sends a message to the industry that Donovan Global is the dominant player, that we can take down even the most established names. That has intangible benefits. I listened to them debate, their voices overlapping with analysis and caution. Finally, I raised a hand, and the room fell silent. I'm not interested in stripping Lancaster Hotels for parts, I said, and I'm not interested in a quick acquisition that ends with their name erased from the market. They looked at me, confused. What I want, I continued, is for them to feel what I felt. I want them to experience dependence, vulnerability, powerlessness. I want Richard and Victoria Lancaster to understand what it's like to need someone they once dismissed. I stood, walking to the window. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to make an offer, one that's just generous enough to be taken seriously, but structured in a way that gives us complete control. Every decision, from staffing to strategy to which properties stay open, will require my approval. They'll keep their titles, keep their offices, but they'll have no real power. They'll be figureheads in a company they no longer control. Lena frowned. That's vindictive. Yes, I agreed. It is, but it's also strategic. If we simply crush them, the story ends. But if we make them live with their choices, if we force them to watch as someone they deemed unworthy decides the fate of their legacy, that's a story that lasts. Marcus grinned. You're terrifying. You know that? I smiled back. I'll take that as a compliment. The negotiation took place over 3 weeks, a carefully choreographed dance of offers and counteroffers, concessions and demands. Richard Lancaster, despite his desperation, tried to maintain some semblance of control, pushing back on the terms I proposed. But every time he resisted, I simply withdrew slightly, letting the silence remind him of his position. He had no leverage, and we both knew it. The final contract was signed on a Tuesday morning in late May in a conference room at Donovan Global's Boston headquarters. Richard and Victoria arrived together, both dressed impeccably, but I could see the toll the stress had taken, the shadows under Richard's eyes, the tightness around Victoria's mouth. They sat across from me at the long table, flanked by their attorneys, while my legal team occupied the seats on either side of me. The signing itself was perfunctory, a series of initials and signatures on documents that had been negotiated down to the last comma. When it was done, Richard extended his hand across the table. To a successful partnership, he said, his voice steady despite everything. I shook his hand briefly. To accountability, I replied. Victoria remained silent throughout, but as they stood to leave, she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Resentment, certainly, but also something that might have been a grudging respect. After they left, Lena leaned over and whispered, "You really did it." "Not yet," I said. "This is just the beginning." Taking over operational control of Lancaster Hotels was like stepping into a house that had been beautifully decorated, but structurally neglected. The lobbies were still grand, the furnishings still expensive, but behind the scenes, everything was crumbling. Staff morale was abysmal, turnover was high, and systems that should have been automated were still being managed manually, leading to inefficiencies and errors that cost money and damaged the guest experience. I spent the first month conducting site visits to every Lancaster Hotels property, from the flagship location in Boston to the smaller boutique hotels scattered across the Northeast. At each one, I met with staff, not just managers, but housekeepers, front desk agents, maintenance workers, the people who actually kept the hotels running. I asked them what they needed, what problems they faced, what changes they would make if they had the authority. The answers were remarkably consistent. They needed better technology, more training, higher wages, and most of all, they needed to feel valued. Many of them had worked for Lancaster Hotels for years, some for decades, but they had never been asked for their input, never been treated as anything more than cogs in a machine. I implemented changes swiftly. New property management software was rolled out across all locations, streamlining operations and improving communication. Wages were increased, starting with the lowest paid employees. Training programs were established, with opportunities for advancement clearly outlined. And I made a point of being visible, of walking through the hotels unannounced, stopping to talk with employees, learning their names, listening to their concerns. Word spread quickly. Staff who had been demoralized under the old management began to take pride in their work again. Guest satisfaction scores started to climb. Revenue, which had been in free fall, stabilized and then began to grow. But the real satisfaction came from the quarterly board meetings, which I attended in person. Richard and Victoria were still on the board, still held their executive titles, but they had no real power. Every proposal they made had to be approved by me. Every decision, from hiring a new general manager to approving a marketing campaign, required my sign-off. At the first board meeting after the acquisition, Richard presented a plan to close one of the underperforming properties in Connecticut. It was a reasonable proposal, backed by financial data showing years of losses, but I rejected it. "We're not closing any properties yet," I said calmly. "We're going to invest in this location, upgrade the facilities, retrain the staff, market it to a different demographic. If it still fails after we've given it every chance to succeed, then we'll consider closure." Richard's face flushed. "With all due respect, Clara, this property has been a drain for years. Throwing money at it isn't going to change that." "With all due respect, Richard," I replied, my tone steady, "the reason it's been a drain is because it's been neglected. You treated it as expendable, and it became exactly that. I'm not interested in cutting losses. I'm interested in building value." The room fell silent. No one challenged me. Richard sat back in his chair, jaw tight, and said nothing more. After the meeting, Victoria lingered as others filed out. She approached me slowly, hesitantly, as if unsure whether I would even acknowledge her. "Clara," she said quietly, "can we talk?" I looked up from the papers I was gathering. "What about?" She glanced around, ensuring we were alone, then took a seat across from me. "I know you have every reason to despise me," she began, her voice low. "I know what I said at that gala was cruel, and I know what I did to your proposal years ago was worse. But I want you to understand, it wasn't personal." I set down my pen and looked at her directly. "Not personal? You humiliated me publicly. You dismissed my work, my worth, my humanity. How is that not personal?" Victoria's composure cracked, just slightly. I was protecting what I thought was mine. The company, the legacy. I saw you as a threat even back then. Not because you lacked talent, but because you had too much of it. And I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" I asked, genuinely curious. "That someone like you, someone who didn't come from wealth, who didn't have connections, who had to fight for every inch, would prove that all of this," she gestured around the room, "was never about merit, that we didn't earn our place, that we were just lucky, and that scared me more than I can explain." I studied her face, searching for sincerity, for manipulation, for anything that would tell me whether this confession was genuine. What I saw was exhaustion, regret, and a vulnerability I hadn't thought Victoria Lancaster capable of. I'm not asking for forgiveness, she continued. I don't deserve it, but I am asking you, please don't destroy this company out of spite. There are people here, employees, families, who depend on Lancaster Hotels. Whatever you think of me, they don't deserve to suffer. I leaned back in my chair, letting her words settle. Then I said, I'm not destroying anything, Victoria. I'm rebuilding it, but I'm rebuilding it in a way that values the people you overlooked, the housekeepers, the front desk staff, the maintenance workers who kept your empire running while you took the credit. That's who I'm doing this for. Not for you. She nodded slowly, tears gathering in her eyes but not falling. Thank you, she whispered, and left the room. Months passed. Lancaster Hotels, under Donovan Global's management, began to thrive in ways it hadn't in years. The Connecticut property I had refused to close was renovated and repositioned as a wellness retreat, targeting a market the old management had never considered. It became profitable within 6 months. Other properties followed similar transformations, each one tailored to its location and clientele, each one proving that with the right investment and respect for both staff and guests, success was achievable. But the most poignant moment came on a rainy evening in October, at the annual Lancaster Hotels Employee Appreciation Gala, a tradition I had insisted on reinstating. The event was held at the Boston flagship, the same ballroom where Victoria had humiliated me years before. I stood on the stage, looking out at hundreds of employees, many of whom had been with the company for decades, and I felt a strange sense of closure. Thank you all for being here, I began. Tonight is about you, the people who make Lancaster Hotels what it is. Not the executives, not the board members, but the individuals who greet guests at 3 a.m, who change linens and fix leaky faucets and answer complaints with patience and grace. You are the heart of this company, and I wanted you to know that you are seen, you are valued, and you are appreciated. The applause was thunderous, genuine, the kind that comes from people who have waited a long time to be acknowledged. As the evening continued, I moved through the crowd, shaking hands, listening to stories, accepting gratitude that felt both overwhelming and humbling. And then, near the edge of the ballroom, I saw him. Ethan Gray. He stood alone, holding a glass of wine, watching me with an expression I couldn't decipher. I hadn't known he would be here, hadn't considered the possibility, and for a moment I felt the old wound open, just a crack. But then I remembered who I was now, what I had built, and the wound sealed over, leaving only scar tissue. Painful, but healed. I walked over to him, my steps measured, deliberate. Ethan, I said, my voice neutral. Clara, he replied, setting down his glass. Congratulations on everything. You've done something incredible. Thank you. An awkward silence stretched between us, filled with all the things we had never said, the future we never had. I heard you got married, I said, not because I wanted to know, but because the conversation required something. He nodded. 2 years ago. It's what it is, a partnership, not a marriage. We have an understanding. I'm sorry to hear that. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw regret etched into every line of his face. I made a mistake, Clara. I should have fought for you, for us. I was a coward. I considered his words, the apology that came too late, the acknowledgement that changed nothing. You made a choice, Ethan. You chose security over risk, legacy over love. I don't blame you for that. It's what you were raised to do. But I chose differently, I interrupted gently, and I'm glad I did. He opened his mouth to say something more, but before he could, a hand touched my arm. I turned to see Michael Reed, the man I had been seeing for the past 6 months. He was tall, with kind eyes and a quiet confidence that never needed to announce itself. He worked in sustainable architecture, building things that would last, that would matter. He had no interest in corporate drama or power games. He simply loved his work, and he loved me for reasons that had nothing to do with status or wealth. "Sorry to interrupt," Michael said, smiling at Ethan politely. "Clara, there's someone who wants to meet you, one of the housekeeping staff who's been here for 30 years. I turned back to Ethan, and in that moment I saw his eyes drop to my left hand, where a simple diamond ring caught the light. His face went pale. "You're engaged." "Yes," I said simply. "I am." I didn't know. Congratulations." I smiled, not unkindly. "Thank you, Ethan. I hope you find what you're looking for." I walked away with Michael, leaving Ethan standing alone in the ballroom, and I felt nothing. No triumph, no anger, no regret. Just a quiet, settled peace. Later that night, after the gala had ended and the guests had gone home, I stood alone in the empty ballroom. The lights were dimmed, and the space felt cavernous, filled with echoes of laughter and applause that had already faded into memory. I walked to the spot where Victoria had stood years ago, where she had raised her glass and delivered the words that had shattered me. I stood in her place, looking out at the empty chairs, and I realized something profound. Revenge, I had thought, would feel like victory. It would feel like vindication, like justice served cold and complete. But standing there, in the aftermath of everything I had achieved, I understood that revenge was never the point. The point was that I had refused to let someone else's cruelty define me. I had taken their rejection and turned it into fuel, their dismissal into determination. I had built something they said was impossible, and I had done it without compromising the values they mocked. I didn't need Victoria Lancaster to apologize, didn't need Richard to acknowledge his mistakes, didn't need Ethan to regret his choices. Their validation was irrelevant, because I had validated myself. The next morning, I returned to my office at Donovan Global and drafted a memo. It outlined a new initiative, a scholarship fund for young people from low-income backgrounds who wanted to pursue careers in hospitality. The fund would cover tuition, housing, and mentorship, with the explicit goal of creating pathways for people who, like me, had been told they didn't belong. I named it the Clara Donovan Opportunity Fund, not out of vanity, but because I wanted every recipient to know that they were carrying forward a legacy of resilience, of refusing to accept the limitations others imposed. The fund launched 6 months later, and the applications poured in. Hundreds of young people with dreams and determination, each one a reminder of who I had been and who they could become. At the launch event, I gave a short speech. I talked about the importance of access, of believing in people who don't have prestigious last names or trust funds. And at the end, I said something I had been thinking about for a long time. Someone once told me I could make reservations, but never sit at the boardroom table, I said, my voice carrying across the room. And you know what? She was right. Because I didn't sit at her boardroom table, I built my own. And now, I'm inviting all of you to join me. The applause was deafening, and as I looked out at the faces of the scholarship recipients, I saw hope, determination, and a future that looked nothing like the past I had escaped. Years later, when people ask me about Lancaster Hotels, about the acquisition and the restructuring and the success that followed, I tell them the truth. It was never about revenge. It was about proving that worth isn't inherited, it's earned. That dignity isn't granted by people in power, it's claimed by people who refuse to be diminished. Victoria Lancaster retired 2 years after the acquisition. Richard followed a year later. I attended their farewell event, shook their hands, wished them well. And I meant it, because by then, They were no longer the villains in my story. They were just people who had made mistakes, who had learned too late that cruelty has consequences, and that empires built on arrogance crumble faster than those built on respect. I still visit Lancaster Hotels properties regularly, still walk through lobbies and talk to staff, still insist that every person, from the CEO to the custodian, deserves to be seen. Because I remember what it felt like to be invisible, and I will never forget. And when I stand on stages now, when I give keynotes and accept awards and shake hands with people who treat me as an equal, I carry with me the memory of the girl in the black staff uniform, the one who was told she would never matter. I carry her with pride because she is the reason I stand here today. If you are reading this, if you have ever been dismissed, overlooked, or told you didn't belong, I want you to know something. Your worth is not determined by the people who failed to see it. You don't need permission to be extraordinary. You don't need validation from those who diminished you. You need only the courage to bet on yourself, to build something from nothing, to refuse the limitations others tried to impose. The world will tell you that certain paths are closed, that certain rooms are not for you, that people like you don't get to sit at certain tables. Ignore them. Build your own path. Open your own doors. Set your own table. And when you succeed, and you will succeed, don't do it for revenge. Do it for the person you were when you felt powerless, when you believed their lies, when you thought maybe they were right. Do it so that one day you can stand in front of a room full of people and say, I was told I didn't belong. So I built a place where I did. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, if you've ever felt the sting of being underestimated or the fire of refusing to accept someone else's narrative, then I want you to do something. Share your story. Not because you need to prove anything to anyone, but because your voice matters. Because there is someone out there right now standing behind a reception desk, or cleaning floors, or working a job where they feel invisible, and they need to know that their current circumstances are not their destiny. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that dignity is non-negotiable, that respect is earned through character, not lineage, and that the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to let anyone tell you that you are less than you are. Because you're not furniture. You're not background noise. You're not a receptionist who should know her place. You are a future CEO, a future leader, a future legacy, and no one gets to take that from you.